We're very pleased to welcome Jasper Coghlan, whose family have holidayed or lived here for over 100 years. He was secretary of the Point Lonsdale Civic Association also for several years till 2015. Most of Jasper's career was with the Ford Company in human resources, and the last 10 years as the manager of remuneration and benefits for the operations in the Asia Pacific region. He became involved in the Alma Doepel in the 1990s when his son gained lifelong benefits from participating in a 9-day development voyage, and then became an active volunteer crew member, also working in other support roles. At the same time, Jasper too participated in a voyage for adults, which included climbing to the top of the mast. In recent years, Jasper has been a volunteer with Tall Ship Alma Doepel, which is owned and operated by Sail and Adventure Limited, a registered charity. He is a member of the Sail and Adventures Board, Fundraising Committee and Voyage, and they're developing programs working group which is focusing on the design of best practice tall ship youth development programs. And quite a few here, I believe, have been on the Alma Doepel or have family who've been on it. Jasper's has a lot of interest in this and put a lot of work into it, and I think it'll be a very interesting presentation. So welcome, Jasper. Thank you.
Oh, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Mary Lou, for the introduction, and Stephen. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet are the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to thank my neighbour Sally Lee for suggesting to Mary Lou that I make this presentation, and for Mary Lou for making it happen along with David Bain. So I'm particularly pleased to be talking at the Historical Museum event, as my father, also Jasper, was a volunteer at the museum when he and my mother Nell lived in Point Lonsdale for about 20 years, starting in 1980. So the topics that I'm going to cover, as shown up there, I'm going to talk about the history of Alma Doepel, the restoration, and I probably should have added in there the museum aspect of our work, because I'm going to be talking about that as well, and then the youth development programs both in the past and the future. So the museum part is we are officially an operational maritime museum. Our deductible gift recipient status, tax deductibility, is based on us being a maritime museum. So if you lived in Queenscliffe or Point Lonsdale in the 1980s or 90s, you would likely saw Alma Doepel in the summer. It would be based in Sorrento and make trips up to the heads. There's a picture here of the Farnsworth, and that's Farnsworth started operating in 1984, so it was at least after 1984 that this picture was taken. And my family and the son made our first trip on Alma Doepel on one of these public trips from Sorrento. And then our son went on the voyage when he turned 15. So I'd like to mention a few of the other Queenscliffe connections. Alma sailed past here many, many times as a coastal trader from 1917 to 1980. And then the youth sail training part from 88 to 99. So the Port Phillip Sea Pilots have been of various contributory roles over many years. Captain John Noble was one of the pilots at the time, a pilot who was a captain of Alma Doepel on a number of voyages, and I'll talk about him later. His daughter was going to try and attend. No. Another notable sea pilot is Captain John Carroll, who was a captain of the ship of Alma Doepel back in the youth sail training era, and he's a board member of Sail and Adventure that owns Alma Doepel. And in present day, Captain Mac Close, the sea pilots, are providing a lot of support to us at the moment. He's the chairman of Port Phillip Sea Pilots. Then Sea Road Ferries. I gather they've supported you as well, but they've provided substantial in-kind support there to us. But importantly, Matt McDonald, the CEO of Sea Road Ferries, is a key restoration driving force. He's the board chair. He started on the Alma Doepel as a trainee at the same time as my son, and they became great mates and still are, because they kept on as volunteer crew people. Matt Messie's wife on board, she was also a volunteer crew person. And then finally, Peter Harris, if there are any yachties from the Queenscliffe Yacht Club, he's our restoration director and board member. He's another driving force behind all of this. I'll talk a little bit later about his role. So he brings his yacht down here in the summer and bases himself at the yacht club for a week or two. So a lot of the history part of the presentation is based on this book written by Captain Ralph McDonnell. So he was a sea captain, well, as it says, captain, a sea captain. His last two ships were the Empress of Australia and the Able Tasman, which were the ferries to Tasmania back in the old days. And he would take time off between voyages and go up to New South Wales to research the Alma. So this book covers the period from the birth of Alma Doepel up till 1975, and as I say, a lot of the research, or a lot of the presentation is based, the early part of the presentation is based on this book, 270 pages, and it was published in 1988. So the ship was built by Frederick Doepel and named after his younger daughter Alma. So this is the certificate of naturalisation, and the important part is that Frederick was born in Kristianstad, Finland, and this certificate of naturalisation was when he was 28 years old. So the certificate was signed in 1884. So he was born in Finland in 1856, and he jumped ship in Sydney in around the age of 14, 15. And then he moved to the Bellinger Valley in 1878. So Bellinger Valley is up in northern New South Wales. And he became a timber mill owner, shipbuilder, trader. The first ship he built was in 1886, the Bellinger. So the Alma, who the ship is named after, was his 8th child, born on the 7th of June 1903. So this is a photo of his timber yard in the early 1900s. They've got some big logs there, and they used some big logs on the ship. So this is a photo of the Alma Doepel under construction. So the construction started in 1902 in Bellingen, which is up the river, part of the Bellinger Valley. Bellingen is 25 kilometres south of Port Macquarie. So in the foreground there, you can see the mast is under construction there. So it's obviously just sitting on the ground at this stage. So this is the launch. So the birthday is the 10th of October 1903 at Bellingen. Obviously it was a big local event. There's some more photos. You can see everyone's dressed up in their finery. So as if you're counting, it's the 120th anniversary this year. The Doepel family are still very much involved interested in the ship, and I'll mention some other interest from them later on. But they've got a family reunion in Bellingen in October to coincide with the 120th anniversary of the birth of Alma. So that's another photo showing it immediately after the launch. Again, everyone's in their finery, the flags and so on. A few of them sitting over the side. And this is another one where she's alongside a droga. So a droga was a flat-bottom punt that was used to carry timber from upstream to Bellingen and also downstream from there. This one's a steam-driven paddle wheeler. So again, plenty of flags and celebrations on the of the launching. So then Alma became a trading ship up and down the coast, particularly to Sydney. So its maiden voyage was in December 1903, which was to Sydney to be officially measured and registered. 1904, it made a number of trips to New Zealand, taking hardwood timber for railway sleepers. But mostly it traded up and down the New South Wales coast to Sydney. So this photo is in Fernmount, loading timber there, which was obviously, given that he had a timber mill, Doepel had a timber mill, that was one of the major cargoes that they were transporting. So this map. So this is Bellingen itself up here. The river, that's Fernmount is just there, the river. And then the entrance here into the ocean, there were sandbars there. And this was a key factor in the design and construction of Alma. So Alma Doepel's got a very shallow draft for a ship like this to enable it to cross the sandbars, and it did get stuck from time to time. It's only 2.3 metres draft, but it has two hinged centreboards that are lowered when it's sailing out to sea to maintain stability. It's like a keel, but a number of ships of that era had this same arrangement. So this is a picture of Alma unloading timber in Sydney in 1914. You can see the timber on the deck, on the wharf there. They always had a little tender with them. They would use that partly to help them berthing. So in 1917, the ship was purchased by Henry Jones, the IXL people in Hobart. It was partly because the trading up and down the coast, the trains were replacing the need for vessels to trade up and down the coast. But one of the reasons why Henry Jones bought the ship was that larger ships were being requisitioned for the Great War. And they needed, and so what was available was smaller ships like this. It would transport jam concentrate to Melbourne, as well as timber, and then general cargo on return. It made trips to Portland with timber, to Adelaide, backloading from Adelaide with fruit, pulp and wheat. Went to Geelong. Geelong was another major port. Williamstown, there's a report of it bringing 190 tonnes of timber sleepers and backloaded with cement. So all sorts of materials and goods were transported in this era. So this is a photo of the ship in Melbourne. So she was part of what's known as the Mosquito Fleet. There are 500 ships like her that transported goods up and down the coast from Tasmania. But Alma Doepel is the only one of the 500 ships left in existence. So they were comparatively small cargo ships. Alma had square rigging, which was unusual, and so she was very fast from that point of view. So she established in 1937 a record time from Melbourne to Hobart, 58 hours. Still quite a time, isn't it, at sea? So this is a photo of Alma at the Royal Hobart Regatta, which they still run every year. It must have been a special vessel in Hobart for it to be in the 30s to be used as the flagship. So she is a topsail schooner, and what a topsail schooner means is that they've got these square yards. So most of the sails are run parallel to the ship. The square yards are at right angles to the ship, and so catch the wind coming from behind. And not many of the Mosquito fleet had that arrangement, so that was one of the reasons why it was a very fast ship. In the Second World War, it was put into service in 1943 as Army Ketch 82, AK being Army Ketch 82. And this is a recently painted picture based on a photo in the next slide. So she was white before, grey obviously in the military era. You can see the main masts have been removed, or all of the masts removed, and a little stubby mast fitted at the front. That's a photo of her at sea. And these are some images of the cargo being unloaded, seamen being transported. So that it operated up in the Pacific Islands, Papua New Guinea, New Britain. And again, the shallow draft was important in being able to get close to shore. These photos are from the Australian War Memorial. So this is part of the museum aspect of Alma Doepel and Sail and Adventure. So this was an exhibition set up in our restoration shed. So our restoration shed is down in Docklands. It's one of those old cargo wharves. There's just one of those cargo wharves remaining now, and that's where we operate from. So this is a banner advertising within the big cargo shed, our exhibition recognising the soldiers at sea. This was funded via a Victorian Remembers grant from the Victorian government. And so it's within a tent. It's in a tent in the shed. So there are interpretive panels, which you'd be familiar with, that sort of thing. Memorabilia, plaques. There's a listing of known army personnel who sailed on her. So that is a temporary exhibition, but one of the key parts, because it's going to be moved to the ship shortly, one of the key parts recognising that the war service, and it is a major conservation challenge, is this beam from one of the decks, one of the crew cabins. So it says on it, 18 crew, certified to accommodate 18 seamen. Now, I've seen the little area where this beam came from, and no way could 18 crewmen be accommodated there. And if you look at it very closely, some wag has carved one in front of the 8. So that is, once it's conserved, going to be mounted back on the ship in a World War II replica cabin. So this was a very confined space, but it's at the bow of the ship. That's one of the bulkheads across there. These are the beams, the interior beams of the hull. So within this area, we're going to build bunks, move some of the plaques and so on from the tent on the shed, and then when we have open days, we'll have explanatory panels out on top of where this is. So there's going to be 4 bunks. The fittings and the painting are going to be replica of the area, of the way it looked. So again, we've obtained another Victoria Remembers grant, $30,000 this year, to move the stuff from the shed and to construct this replica cabin. So I've been part of the team figuring out how to make this all work, what we should do within the cabin, what parts of the existing display can be moved there. And I wrote the funding submission, and prior to writing the funding submission, guess where I came to get some ideas? Your museum. And I must say I was very impressed with your museum and all the displays there. So, following the war, 1946, Alma was restored back to sailing condition, and she sailed the Tasman again, still part of Henry Jones IXL, for the next 15 years. It's got a black hull at this stage. So then the next chapter in Alma's life started in 1961, and so for the next 15 years it transported limestone along Tasmania's southern coast. You can see these metal boxes and lumps of limestone. So that's what it did for the next 15 years. And then in 1976 it was purchased by Sail and Adventure to provide youth sail training. So it cost $8,000, which was basically the scrap value of the engines. So this shows the start of the restoration. They're stripping off the deck, and all of the surrounds of the ship have been removed. So this is another stage. So fortunately they were able to obtain a berth up on the Yarra, and so the work took place while the vessel was moored, and you can see the masts have been erected here. So this is the ship's wheel from the 1940s. So it's an open wheel at the back, and that's being reinstated as part of this restoration. You might have noticed in the war service, and as the limestone carrier, there was a cabin at the back, and the steerage was in that. But one of the interesting things here is the chains. They've got chains. The steering goes back to chains, and the chains then go down below water to move the rudder from side to side. So this is the ship's wheel after the restoration. The chains have been replaced by metal bars, I guess you call them. This is not the original wheel. If you count the number of spokes on the previous photo and this photo, which I did to see whether it was the original wheel, it's not the original wheel. But importantly here on the right is a photo of Michael Wood. Now, Stephen mentioned to me that he knows Michael, knew Michael. He's now deceased. He was the driving force behind Alma Doepel being rescued from being an abandoned hulk to getting it restored, and he would be captaining the ship during youth sail training as well, which I didn't know till Stephen told me that he was a captain of the ship as well. So one of the things we're doing with this restoration is making the ship available for people with physical disabilities. So one of the things we're doing at this part of the ship is we're going to have a platform that can be lifted hydraulically, so a wheelchair can go onto this platform, then be lifted hydraulically to enable someone in a wheelchair to manipulate the wheel, turn the wheel. And there are other features which I'll mention later on to make the ship more accessible for people with disabilities. So this is a view of the ship after the restoration. It's looking much more like a sailing ship again. You know, the masts, the stays holding up the masts, two of the forward masts shown there. So someone, the 1 minute video YouTube on this presentation mentions the mishaps. The one mishap that I would like to mention, Alma ran aground a few times and went through a few storms, but the one major modern era mishap was in 1985 when she ran aground at Safety Beach near Dramana. The story is that nearly all the crew were ashore and an unexpected wind came up. The ship dragged its anchor and finished up beached on the shore there. Good old Holden station wagon there. So it was quite an effort to get it off there, and ships like that have ballast, and so they had to unload a lot of the ballast, and they sold some of the ballast to fund the hiring or purchase of pumps to suck away the sand. It might have been lead ballast. I'm not quite sure what the actual ballast was. So, but it was obviously they did get it off. But that was rather an embarrassment, I would have to say. But again, you can see from this the shallow draft. You know, it's right on the sand, but it's not very high up off the sand. So the full restoration was completed about 12 years after it started, and it was completed just in time for the 1988 bicentenary parade of sail in Sydney Harbour. And the last part that was put on, you know, you could see that previous photo from 1985, you know, the ship was pretty well complete, but the deck houses were the last parts added. And that was all done at the last minute, and she got up to Sydney to participate in the parade of sail. So this is a plaque that says Australian Bicentenary Tall Ship Event, Sydney Harbour, 26th of January 1988, presented to Captain John Noble, with grateful thanks from the crew of Alma Doepel. So Captain John Noble is one of the Port Phillip sea pilots that I mentioned earlier on. He regularly was a captain of the ship of Alma Doepel, and this was in recognition of him captaining the ship up to Sydney. So this photo was is held by his daughter. It hangs on her house and she's a friend of ours in Geelong. So that's the story of that. So then, 1988 to 1999, the next 10 years was youth development training. So there are 36 bunks below deck. This is what the configuration back then. We run 9-day voyages around Port Phillip Bay. And part of the restoration, as I mentioned, so as she was at that era, there were 36 bunks, just divided male, female, 50-50%. So we're in the new restoration, we're going to have smaller cabins to provide flexibility of who goes on, who's participating. But in terms of people with disabilities, you go down virtually down a vertical ladder to get to the bunkhouses. So that's no good for anyone with a physical disability. So one of the cabins on deck is going to be converted with 4 bunks for disability-friendly 4 bunks, 2 for trainees with disabilities and 2 for carers. And there's going to be a disability bathroom as well. Now, other modifications have to be made to the ship to enable access into the saloon, the dining area where all the training takes place, that sort of thing. So this is a view of Alma in Docklands in the 1990s. So it was based on a cargo shed on the northwest side of Victoria Harbour in Docklands. She's on the southeast side at the moment. So it's the northeast, northwest side where most of the big tall buildings are at the moment. So the observant people might see that's the control tower, the harbour control tower from that era. It's no longer operating, but there's no Bolte Bridge there. This is looking down towards the mouth of the Yarra. There's no Bolte Bridge. So when they were constructing the Bolte Bridge, someone fortunately said, hang on, Alma's not going to get under it the way you're planning to build it. So the story is Jeff Kennett said it's going to be 2 metres higher. Anyway, it was raised and Alma can get under the Bolte Bridge. So that's fortunate. So this is another a view of the stern. It's got a nice fancy nameplate on the back. Hobart is the port of registration in that era. See the various cabins. You can see the ship's wheel still out in the open there. Sails are furled, ready to set off. This is the view of snapshots of the sailing in that era. There's a lot of teamwork required by the trainees, and resilience building is the way they're talked about these days. Seasickness, wet from the rain in the sea, sleepless nights, had to be up at middle of the night for watches. But it was a major confidence builder. Climbing the mast is quite a challenge as well. Another one, climbing the mast. The view down from the top of the mast, I have climbed the mast as mentioned earlier. It's a bit scary from looking down. And a classic display of crew. So then the ship in 1999 lost survey. The Maritime Authority said you can no longer sail because the ship's hull has deteriorated. So for the next 10 years was spent up at Port Macquarie as a static display. The Doepel family were involved in moving it up there. It's the closest port to Bellingen. Unfortunately, the hulls have started to deteriorate. Shipworm took hold, the termites of the sea. They needed so a decision was taken to bring it. The only way to save it was to bring it back to Melbourne and to restore it. They put canvas, they stapled canvas to the exterior of the hull. Here's the ship arriving back in Docklands. It was quite a hazardous trip down. My son was on the ship at that time. There was a risk of it falling apart, but it didn't. So then the restoration took place in Docklands, removing basically stripping the ship back. The engine's been removed. We've got 2 new engines ready to go back in. We've had a lot of support from the maritime industry. Cummins have given us 2 engines. For a nominal cost, we've acquired 2 engines. They were superseded engines, which they were about to ship back to the US for scrapping, which was, anyway. So after all the stripping back, the ship was then floated onto a custom-made barge, and this was done at the graving dock at Williamstown. Here she is floating, and you can see the very poor condition of the hull. She did have, even then, bow thrusters. So this is the hull on the barge. This is the hull restoration completed. Tremendous amount of work gone into that by volunteers, painstaking work, bending the timbers, caulking the gaps. The Australian Maritime Safety check everything along the way, and one of the things is we have to use professional shipwrights for some of the work. There's a guy, Ferdy Darley, traditional shipwrights. The shipwrights come from him. So this is a view of the ship just before it went back into the water. The stern. You can see the nameplate now says Melbourne. It's going to be registered in Melbourne. So this was all done by a AAL Shanghai heavy lift ship. They used the cranes on the ship to lift it off the barge, back into the water. Degree of nervousness about all of that. Was it going to leak? Were there going to be leaks in the hull, water around the propellers? We had 6 pumps and an electric generator to pump out any water, but fortunately there were no leaks. So this is the ship coming back to Docklands. You can see the Balti Bridge in the background. Svitzer tugs, again for nothing. No charge to us, spent over 8 hours. You can imagine the Maritime Union costs of labour and the tugs not being able to use for other purposes. There was a bit of a nervous moment. They're huge tugs, one at each end, and the lines got a bit taut, and there was a bit concerned that they were going to pull the ship apart. So there it is, and it's the modern Docklands in the background. So the restoration continues. These are pictures of the restoration, the various timbers that are being used. So the deck is nearly completed. The timber for the deck, it's going to have it's got layers of plywood and epoxy, and then it's going to have planks on top of that to make the top surface, but it's the old deck planks are going to be cut in half to do that. So a lot of the restoration, we've been doing a lot of recycling of timbers. The cross beams have been laminated rather than, we just couldn't find the timbers to restore, to put in. So look, the restoration has cost about, it's going to cost about 5 million or more than 5 million. Yeah, we need another 1 million to go or thereabouts. So sponsorships, grants and donations, mix of the shipwrights, as I mentioned before, they don't come cheaply. We've had 95,000 hours of volunteer work. So we have no paid staff. Peter Harris, that I mentioned earlier, worked full-time, more than full-time, as the restoration director on a voluntary basis. So we're going to return to youth sail training under the banner of the Waypoint Foundation, and we've got a working group developing best practice voyage programs. Often asked how you can help, how people can help. Tax-deductible donations are sponsor part of the ship. So if you want more information about Alma, we've got an excellent website. You can visit the ship at the restoration shed, and hopefully if you've ever been on the ferry from Port Arlington, you will tootle past it just before you berth at the dock in Docklands. We're on the right there. We've got newsletters, our friend of Alma Doepel, membership for $50. So the book is available. We had a reprint. I can sell you a book. If anyone wants one, I can arrange a purchase and hand deliver it to you.